Everyone, or good morning, depending on where you're logged in from. My name is Caroline Bugwa, Senior Policy Manager, Sub Saharan Africa at the GSMA, and I lead policy engagements in the East Africa region. We are excited to be hosting this session, and I would like to take this opportunity to welcome you all. We have fantastic speakers lined up who will be discussing the issue of enabling universal access and the role universal service funds play. We'll also be covering a bit of issues to do with coverage and also the usage gap. In addition, we'll also have policy recommendations aimed at accelerating internet adoption in the region. And of course, we'll touch on our capacity building program. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentations, and I encourage you all to kindly post your questions under the Q&A section, and I will read them out for the speakers to respond. I look forward to a very informative and interactive sessions. Feel free to post your questions as and when they pop up, and we'll have them responded to. Thank you very much for joining us once again. And with no further ado, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Mel, who's going to introduce himself and take us through the first half of the session. Thank you very much and welcome, Mel.
Thank you, Caroline, for the great introduction, and thank you for everybody dialing in to join this webinar. So to set the stage, I'd like to discuss a little bit the dynamics of digital inclusion. And I think as we all follow a number of webinars these days online, I think every speaker starts with the fact that access to the internet is more important than ever, especially in this time of crisis that we see across the world. However, when we look at the number of people who are already online, we see that 4 billion people, close to 4 billion people, do not use the internet. Now, often we speak about those lacking access to the internet as having no access to coverage. But when we look at the total number that do not have access to mobile broadband network is only 600 million people. Much bigger number of the people that are not yet online do already have access to mobile broadband, but are not using the internet yet for different reasons. Go to the next slide, please. When we look in Africa, we see that there has been tremendous progress in the rollout of mobile broadband networks. So in the blue, you can see the numbers declining from 51% who had not been covered by mobile broadband in 2014 to just 24% last year. So this is the result of significant investments by mobile operators in the continent. Over the past 5 years, mobile operators have invested about $50 billion to expand mobile broadband coverage, now covering around 77% of the population in Africa. Now, that leaves another 51% without internet use. So whereas a lot of people are covered, we only see an uptake of the mobile internet of 26%. It's very important to address this number of people, who is 550 million people in Africa, who are covered but are not using the mobile internet yet. There's a different type of reasons why we're not using the internet yet. The next slide. Based on consumer surveys and research by the GSMA, we identified 5 key barriers of why people are not online. So if we look at the most left column, we see the data for Africa, where it explains that the people who are aware that the internet exists, that's the first step, is awareness of the internet. But this data looks at the people who do know that the internet is available, are aware of its benefits. We see that 34% of those people say they lack the necessary skills to go online. 30% indicates that internet services are not affordable yet. Then there's also a critical element of relevant services. So what this means is that for many people who are aware of the internet, they do not recognize the benefits it can bring to their lives. This can be because there's no relevant services to the needs, but it can also be because the services that would benefit are not available in a local language or in a format that people would understand. The two other barriers are related to safety and security concerns. So this is increasingly important around the concerns for privacy, but also misinformation or the negative side of the internet. This is especially a concern for many women around the world who often feel insecure because of threats of online harassment or cyberbullying, for example. Finally, accessibility and access is an important factor, and this relates to access to enabling factors, such as do people have a formal identification to be able to register for mobile internet services? Is there electricity available to charge the smartphones? Are smartphones accessible enough for people maybe with that have certain disabilities? And is there a relevant infrastructure available that people can connect to? So when we talk about digital inclusion, I think it's important that we focus on the barriers that prevent people from using the internet, because as an industry, we have made great progress on achieving network coverage across the continent. What we would like to achieve is by addressing these 5 barriers to policy interventions, slide please, to move countries from, this looks like a complicated graph, but move countries from the upper right quadrant, that should be we need to move countries to the upper right quadrant. So the countries mapped in this graph on the right, upper right, they show that there is a large usage gap. So the usage gap between people that have already access to broadband network that are not yet online. But we also see very fast uptake of the mobile internet, meaning that the usage gap will slow over time. However, countries in the down right corner, so such as countries like Kenya, Niger, Tanzania, there exists a large usage gap of over 45% of the population, but we also see a lack of internet usage growth. So in order for mobile operators to recoup investments on their networks, but also for governments to ensure that everyone is connected to a digital future, we need to focus on the 5 barriers explained before to move everyone into greater digital inclusion and internet growth. That was my brief introduction to digital inclusion. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions later on.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mel, and for that great presentation. And as Mel has just mentioned, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the Q&A session, and we'll be able to address them. The speakers are still with us. So in the next session, I'm going to welcome my colleague Kamal, who's going to cover the rest of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carol and Melia, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone on that's managed to dial in. It's in really interesting times that we live in these days. I don't think that this time last year we would have been thinking about hosting an event like this in the manner that we're doing right now. And the fact that we're actually even hosting the event this way speaks volumes to sections of the topic that we're even discussing to do. You know, it further emphasizes this need for us to all be able to have access, and we are amongst the fortunate ones in the statistics that Medley has just presented, in that we are able to afford, we're able to be digitally literate enough to be able to use this service, and and actually benefit and see the value that it provides in our lives. And it is more emphasizing of the need for us to also focus on providing this level of access as well to the underprivileged and the section of society that doesn't have as much access as we do. As Carol just mentioned earlier, my name is Kamal. I am a policy manager as well with the Sub-Saharan Africa policy team. Sounds like somebody's typing. And I cover policy and regulatory issues as well for the GSMA within the Sub-Saharan Africa region. I think there's been mention of universal service and universal access, and there's a number of definitions that are out and about, and it's very difficult, or it's not as easy as it would seem to actually pin down on one particular definition for universal access and universal service. But suffice to say that from our perspective, the concept is really underpinned by three basic principles. So in the first instance, we're talking about availability. So we're trying to provide the same level of service to all users, regardless of their place of work, their residence, their geographical locations, at all times and without any sort of geographical discrimination. The second principle is around affordability. So it is providing that level of service as well in a manner that is affordable at price points that do not factor as limiting entities for people to be able to have access to the service that is being provided. And then the third is in terms of accessibility. So all of the users of internet access or mobile telephone access should be treated in a non-discriminatory manner, regardless of their purchasing power, regardless of the kind of service that is intended to be provided, in terms of the quality of the service that needs to be provided. Again, in terms of regardless of their geographical location, there should be no distinction in terms of race, sex, religion, age. That is the level of access that should be provided, and it should all be universal and the same for every single person. Now, there are a number of factors that contribute to why universal access is even a topic of discussion in the first place. Ideally, you'd expect that this should be, all things being equal, everybody should really have that level of access. But there are factors that exist to prevent universal access from being a reality, and Melly highlighted quite a number of them. From an infrastructure perspective and looking at it from the perspective of the service provider, apart from the commercially viable, densely populated urban areas and semi-urban areas, peri-urban areas that you will find most deployments, the areas that either do not have access at all or are underserved in terms of access are typically characterized with having difficult terrain, for instance. So geographically, it is either very difficult to even access these places so that you can build out the infrastructure, or there are other factors that exist to prevent accessing these sorts of places. So yes, the area itself might be, for instance, plain or level ground, but the roads that lead to that kind of place, for example, probably do not exist. You don't probably have access to good electricity in those sorts of areas. So even providing the infrastructure there, empowering it, is a huge challenge from an infrastructure service provider's perspective. Second aspect is affordability. So you find that a lot of the residents in these sorts of areas are, so to speak, at the bottom of the social pyramid in terms of their purchasing power, their economic strength. And so with the income that they have, access to telephony services really are at the bottom of a list of priorities, if at all on a list of any of their priorities. So you find that affordability is a key factor to seeing infrastructure being deployed in these sorts of places. Relevant content was one of the things Amelie highlighted earlier. And again, this speaks to the fact that people cannot connect with the content that this access is actually giving them access to, basically. There's content online, but does it speak to the issues that they face? If they have access to it, how does it impact on their lives? Is it in a language that they speak? Is it in a language that they understand? This is a key and recurring decimal basically that you find in any universal service and universal access conversation that you'll be having. Digital literacy again is one of the things that was highlighted earlier. It speaks to people's ability to actually use devices that they need to be able to access the telephony services that are being provided. So lots of the time you find that residents in these areas are not able to actually even use the devices. Forget about even being able to afford them in the first instance. Using them is a key issue in itself. And general value perception of access. Again, this is closely related to the item of relevant content. People cannot connect to why they need to access telephony services. It doesn't mean anything to them. You know, they're subsistence farmers, or they live very basic, simple lives, and they cannot really see the relevance of having this sort of internet connectivity. Anytime I speak to this slide, I give an example of my grandmother, who my parents and their siblings got tired of having to communicate with her through proxies, and they bought her a mobile phone, and they continue to have challenges communicating with her. And at some point, they did some investigation and realized that what typically happens is when my grandmother wants to communicate with them, she uses the phone, but then as soon as she's done, she wraps it up, puts it back in its box, and then puts it back in the drawer, and then leaves it on until at such a time when she feels that she needs it again. So there's no connection with the fact that this device needs to be constantly on so that it can be connected all the time. There's no connection with the fact that apart from just speaking to her children, you know, there's actually a lot more that you can also do with access that is being provided to you through this device. And then again, from the mobile service providers perspective, for revenues prospects. So all of these factors basically combine to the fact that at the end of the day, it makes no commercial sense for them to deploy services and deploy infrastructure, expensive infrastructure into these sorts of areas so that they can provide the service that we're looking to provide in terms of universal service. So speaking to the costs of deployment, you find that bringing mobile broadband to rural populations, it obviously requires very, very large investment, so that a lot of these factors that we spoke about can be overcome in the first instance, before we even start talking about simple commercial sense. So operators face a lot of these difficulties to invest in these areas. One of the facts in terms of looking at it from a capital expenditure perspective, deploying sites in these areas cost 1.3 times more per site than it does in a typical regular urban area. In terms of operating expenditure, it costs twice as much as it does in urban areas to continue to run the site after you have actually even built them. And then to cap it all up, it actually gives you 10 times less revenue per site in these sorts of areas than you get in your typical urban area after sites have been deployed. So this sort of paints a picture of how all of those factors basically culminate to a picture that doesn't look very positive from a service provider's perspective in terms of the motivation to deploy services and deploy infrastructure in these sorts of areas. But be that as it may, operators and the GSMA continue to explore ways of decreasing the rollout and operational costs. One such area is obviously in finding ways to optimize the rollout and optimizing the operating costs. Innovative radio access network solutions that drive down the cost, that limit the deployment logistics of these sorts of sites and the running costs as well, are areas that operators look at. The second aspect, second and very popular aspect as well in terms of voluntary infrastructure sharing. So this is in the form of either sharing the physical infrastructure itself, or the active infrastructure that is deployed on the physical infrastructure. Sharing with fellow service providers helps to share the cost across these service providers, and naturally also brings this cost down for the service providers. And then finally, obviously, I mean, from a network deployment perspective, there are efforts all the time to optimize the placement of sites so that they make the most sense, and then they provide the most optimal service from a cost effective perspective. So I mean, this is some of the initiatives that are taken from the operator perspective. I mean, we'll be speaking about some of the areas that policy and regulation as well will play in terms of helping to bridge this gap as we proceed. But there are various regulatory and policy approaches that are used to address these universal service requirements. Obviously, there's a role for industry to play, and there's always going to be a role for government and policy as well to be able to help that gap to be bridged. One of those, one key area in that aspect is in terms of having a market-based reforms perspective. So this is in terms of development of a modern regulatory framework that includes the addressing of impact of convergence, the establishment of an independent and effective regulator, for example, regulating competition effectively, allowing technology neutral licensing and unified licensing or general authorizations. And then in the area of management of spectrum resources, maximizing the use of this very scarce resource and allowing for innovative and emerging technologies, including broadband wireless access, to be deployed using spectrum. The second aspect is in the form of license obligations. There are always ways in which you can play with license obligations to ensure that universal access and universal service objectives are achieved. You can play around with the cost, for example, of licenses combined with the license obligations, and see that a balance is struck in terms of providing the service providers with the license to be able to deploy services, but then also being able to include some obligations in those licenses that are required to be met in order for universal service obligations to be met. Public-private partnerships, so you find instances where it is possible to create a framework that government and private sector and related stakeholders as well partner in deploying not just the infrastructure as well, but ensuring that the services that are deployed using that infrastructure as well have the reach that is required and help to achieve the universal service objectives that are listed and government is looking to achieve. In terms of cross subsidies, investment in high cost or low revenue services and market segments with excess profits, you can get some of the excess profits from those sorts of areas and invest in deploying in lower income, more challenging areas. And this is a methodology that perhaps is not as common as it used to be in the past, but it's certainly one that was held in high regard at some point in the past, and back when we used to have a lot more monopolies that were state owned. Access deficit charges are again similar concept, basically subsidizing a lot of the access in these sorts of areas with excess revenues that you gain as well from highly profitable areas where infrastructure is already deployed. And then finally, the universal service funds, where you find that in addition to market-based reforms and mandatory license obligations, you find that increasingly there's a common approach to help achieve universal service goals by creating a funding mechanism, universal service funds, which are intended to serve as a financial incentive for operators to provide universal service. And we'll be speaking a lot more to this particular one in the next couple of slides. So back in 2013, we did conduct a study on universal service funds. The study covered 64 universal service funds around the world. The research covered the description of individual countries' universal service funds. So in terms of the history of the fund, the foundations of how it came about, the framework within which these universal service funds exist, the source of funding, where and how these funds are populated, and the structure of the fund itself, the process of allocation, how these funds are allowed to be accessed by service providers or by the Universal Service Fund itself in making universal service possible, and then the degree of industry participation in the activities of the fund. The report also highlighted examples of best practice in terms of the Universal Service Fund, placing an emphasis on the processes that are used to allocate the funds. And this information was accompanied by supporting information as to how and why these Universal Service Funds had been successful. It then also looked at the challenges and pitfalls of administering a universal service fund. Obviously, and as we'll speak to in the next couple of slides, you'll find that these funds face a number of challenges, and that piece of research aimed to look at many of these challenges and pitfalls. Then it also examined and highlighted a selected set of examples of alternative approaches to achieving universal service coverage objectives as alternatives to universal service funds. Now, obviously, this study was conducted back in 2013, and we recently did have a conversation about whether there was a need for us to revisit that study, reconduct it, and see where we are at. And a cursory look at the general environment indicated to us that there really hadn't been too much change in the environment in terms of the outcomes that this report came to. That warranted the need for us to go through another study. So we keep on monitoring the entire environment, and at some point in the future as well, I'm sure we'll be revisiting this topic again to see if we can update this report. But suffice to say that some of the key findings from that report I will speak to on this slide. So the first is in terms of the fund structure itself. So there were significant deficiencies in the fund structure in terms of management and operation. So many cases you find, for example, that funds were being established and levies were collected, but the fund had not even actually been officially activated, for instance. Then there were also underlying legal framework issues in terms of the fact that many of the funds were not well thought out or conceived from the outset. So, for instance, they did not allow technology neutrality or service flexibility. They were excessively bureaucratic. There was the level of oversight that was needed to manage the funds was a major shortcoming as well. In terms of administrative and efficiency, what that report found was that many of the funds suffered from, or they had been accused of, poor or inefficient administration or use of the funds. Even in funds where there was a degree of autonomy or independence, there were many cases where, for instance, political intervention or interference from other government agencies or external entities affected how the fund performed and the kind of activities that the funds undertook. In terms of targets and objectives that the funds set out to achieve, what we found was that 22 out of those over 60 funds did not even have any established coverage or delivery target at all. So they had set out without any targets in the first instance. There was an additional 2 funds that were not even yet fully defined, and so for those ones you couldn't even see that targets could be set. But then there was another 8 that did not lend themselves to setting of targets because they were basically a sort of like refund mechanism. So you go out, deploy, and then come back to us with a receipt to show that you had deployed in those areas, and you basically get a receipt. But in terms of setting out targets in the first instance, there was none. But over 50% of the funds that had been studied had some form of target setting, and out of those, only about 20 had precisely quantified targets and goals. From a project execution perspective, what we saw was that many of these funds seemed unable to develop enough projects to even adequately utilize the levies collected. So there was a pool of funds, but then what do we need? What kind of projects should we even undertake in the first instance to actually achieve the objectives that we had set out to? Many of the funds had significant challenges with finding appropriate projects to be able to undertake to help achieve those universal service objectives. And then, even though many of the active funds appear to have sort of transparent project allocation processes, there was always a case that the ball started to drop in terms of project monitoring, tracking, and reporting. There was always issues around continuity, basically, of those projects. And in many instances, we also found that the programs and targets established for the deployment of telecenters and community information centers, they had failed to take into account issues related to training, education, maintenance, power sources, other sustainability concerns, basically, that will allow those the infrastructure that has been deployed to continue to make sustainable sense. And then in terms of funding and finances, so what we found was that the levies and taxes that had been established for most of the USF contributions, it seemed as though they had been set up arbitrarily. They hadn't been set up with any substantive analysis regarding how much was actually going to be needed to make universal service possible. Many of the funds received contributions that appear to be far in excess of the actual USF needs or the capabilities of the fund itself. And only 64% of these, the universal service funds, had carried out some level of disbursement or reported that some disbursement had been made. So there was issues around the fact that the funds existed within the entity itself, but then dispersing the funds was not happening. And more than 1/3 of the USFs had yet to disperse any of the levies collected at all. One recurring decimal was around the transparency in terms of project and financial reporting. So what this report found was that for most of the funds that were studied, there was inadequacy, extreme inadequacy in terms of reporting financial and project performance of the funds themselves. So what you find in the end was that 19 of the 23 USFs covered in the report had more than $400 million that had been waiting to be dispersed, and this was as at the end of 2011. But this was unlikely to actually even have been completely accurate, because there's all the possibility that figure was significantly understated because of the lack of reliable reporting and information. So there are many instances where, obviously, because this is a popular sort of approach to addressing a universal access and universal service issue, you do find that many governments, many regulators are thinking about setting up universal service funds. And at the GSMA, what we say is, if you don't have a universal service fund currently, you really do not actually have a problem. There is most likely no need for you to set it up, because from what we've seen, the justification for why the funds should exist in the first instance is not as strong as the need to focus on other possible methods with which to address universal service objectives, and I'll be speaking to some of these further down this presentation. If there are funds that already exist but have been identified as underperforming and not helping to achieve the objectives that have been initially set out for, we recommend that consideration should be given to two possible directions. So wherever feasible, in the case of completely inactive funds, we do recommend that these funds are disbanded in the first instance completely, and then any funds that have been contributed to by stakeholders, service providers, all of these funds should be returned to these contributors. Now, obviously, this is, as you'd expect, this is a more difficult situation and scenario to find oneself in. But wherever feasible, as an alternative, we also recommend that there should be a gradual reduction in the levies that are collected until basically the fund is phased out in its entirety. And again, the recommendation speaks specifically to funds where there is very, very high level of inactivity or there's no activity completely at all. Now, in funds where there is some level of activity and there are exceptions to the rule, there are quite a few that there's one or two that actually do make good use of the fund in terms of addressing this universal service problem. We have recommendations that speak to how some of these issues that we mentioned earlier can be addressed. So establishing the Universal Service Fund as a separate independent entity that is free from political interference should be first and foremost. This will ensure that the fund is operating independently of any influence and it focuses on the objectives that it's set out to achieve without actually digressing into issues that do not necessarily wholly associate with universal service. Articulating a very clear policy with respect to how these universal service objectives are going to be achieved and how the universal service fund is going to be put to use is also a very, very critical underpinning factor for how successful universal service funds can be. So it's very important that these goals are set out clearly so that there is a very clear roadmap as to how the fund is going to achieve its objectives. Developing a very clear, modern legal and regulatory framework is also key. So you do not want to find a situation where the fund has been created, the policy is clear, but then the legal and regulatory framework is a limiting factor in terms of how effective that fund can be in itself. Then also developing and clearly articulating measurable objectives which can be clearly tracked and monitored is also key. I mean, I think this really, it makes very clear sense. It's about stating the obvious. There should be a way to ensure that if the fund has set out to do A, B, and C, there is a way to monitor A, B, and C to a logical conclusion, and also to be able to track how it and then at some point to be able to see what kind of impact those activities are having. And this is one of the key areas where universal service funds that are fairly active should also focus on. Having high levels of transparency, visibility, and accountability to all stakeholders. I have seen a few universal service funds that pretty much publish all of their financial statements. They have on their governing boards, for example, representation from all of the stakeholders that participate. So there's clear visibility of how the fund is performing, what kind of activities the fund is going to undertake. There's accountability to the people that actually contribute into that fund. And I think this is absolutely critical for any potential universal service fund that is currently existing to be fairly successful. One of the key areas, one of the key stumbling blocks that we found as well in that report that I mentioned earlier was in terms of the process of accessing the fund and allocating funds for projects and subsidies. So it's very important for there to be a very clean, clear, transparent, fair, unbiased process within which these projects and subsidies are allocated. Then also there is the need for there to be an ensuring of the full range of sustainability elements and complementary services that are taken into consideration in both the formulation of the policies upon which these universal service funds will perform, and also the definition of the projects that the fund will undertake. Many times you find that there is a very strong focus, for instance, and you find this even today, there's a very strong focus on deploying the physical infrastructure itself. And this is just addressing the capital expenditure perspective. There isn't so much of a focus on what happens after that infrastructure is deployed. There's going to be operating expenditure. How is that going to be tackled? Because at the end of the day, it is a very key and expensive element of deploying rural infrastructure and infrastructure in unserved and underserved areas. And then even if where that is addressed, how then do you address, is there a focus on the demand? I mean, you solved the supply side problem, you've built the infrastructure, but how do you then make it sustainable in the long term? How do you address the demand side problems to make sure that the services that infrastructure is providing are actually used? so that at some point the deployment of that site makes commercial sense. Is there an element of policy formulation that focuses on this as well? This is the key element that needs a lot of focus. Then there's a need to also develop projects in a way that incentivize participation from the stakeholders. So many times you find that the funds set out in good faith, set out to introduce projects that they feel will help to address the universal service fund, the universal service problem. But then you find that a lot of the stakeholders that either contribute to the fund or are better placed to be able to use the funds to help the fund achieve its objectives do not find these projects particularly appealing or related to any of the work that they do. And so you find that they are not very keen to participate in these sorts of projects. So there's a need to join the dotted lines, basically, join the dots. What kind of activities will stakeholders perform? What's the problem that needs to be solved? Then what kind of activities can we put in place between these two factors to be able to help bridge that universal service fund problem? Then there's the need to implement policies that incorporate digital inclusion. And I think Melly highlighted quite a lot around some of the elements of digital inclusion, but generally society needs to, where other policies that drive society are being developed, elements of digital inclusion need to be considered and also included. So is it policies around education? Is it policies around internal trade? Is it policies around foreign trade? All of these need to take into consideration the universal access problem, and from that perspective, include elements of digital inclusion in formulating those policies. And then finally, I mean, there are a number of recommendations that we could make, but finally, active participation in the input in inputs and collecting inputs from all concerned stakeholders regarding fund objectives and administration is absolutely key to the success of these funds. And you find that in many of the places where these funds are fairly successful, you do see that there is a lot of this level of interaction between the fund and the contributors to the fund, and that helps to drive the success of these funds in these areas. So I've spoken to basically three levels of funds. So in the first instance, I mentioned what to do with funds that where a fund does not exist yet, but there's a thought as to whether the fund should be developed in the first place. And then I mentioned what to do in terms of funds that currently exist, but clearly do not help to achieve the universal service fund objectives that the government has set out to achieve. These are funds that are typically fairly inactive, and there's no level of disbursement that is happening at all. And then I've spoken to areas of improvement for funds that exist that are fairly active and are to a large extent maybe helping to achieve some of the objectives that the funds have set out to achieve. But generally speaking, there is still a need for policy and regulatory levers to be pulled in helping to address the coverage gap, regardless of whether universal service funds are used as a tool to help bridge this gap or not. In the end, if these policy and regulatory frameworks and foundations do not exist, it makes it will continue to perpetuate the coverage gap in particular. And especially in modern day, you find that a lot of the activities that are needed to help bridge this coverage gap are activities that need to be from a private sector perspective. So if private sector is going to be the key driver of this, then there is a need to ensure that the policy and regulatory framework is investment friendly. It is a framework that invites investment and helps to enable supply. So one key area where there's this sort of framework can focus on is in terms of introduction and implementation of best practice progressive regulation. So regulation for the modern day. We're in 2020. We should not still have regulatory and policy practices that are for the analog age, for instance. These are areas where you begin to talk about concepts such as allowing technology neutrality, for example. This is a very, very key area in terms of allowing the most efficient use of resources, and improving efficiency is obviously, and I think the emphasis cannot be overstated, is going to be key to helping to bridge that coverage gap. The second area is in terms of identifying and the issues around the costs for deployment, and helping to introduce policy and regulation that reduce these deployment costs. Obviously, I mentioned technology neutrality now, but one key area as well is in terms of allowing infrastructure sharing, for example. We need to create regulatory frameworks, and largely we have this, especially in Sub Saharan Africa. We have frameworks that allow the sharing of passive infrastructure, but you find it less so in terms of allowing the sharing of active elements of the network. So the antenna systems themselves, the cabling systems that connect all of these infrastructure elements. You find that less and less there isn't the framework that allows for these elements to be shared. And this is the motivation for this comes from a legacy sort of thought process at some point where there was a dearth in infrastructure, and the objectives of policy and regulation at the time was to help proliferate the deployment of infrastructure. But largely now you will find that there is enough infrastructure to be able to see that some of these legacy thought processes are revisited, and regulation and policy is made to fall in line as well. Creating a pro-investment spectrum policy. Obviously, we're talking about an environment that operates largely on wireless technology here, and access to spectrum is going to be is absolutely key to making this possible. If the spectrum policy in the first instance is discouraging to investment, then I think pretty much half of the work that needs to be done is basically going down the drain. We need to price spectrum correctly. We need to make it available in large enough quantities and at the right time. Avoid taking positions that sort of restrict access to spectrum for the purposes of creating artificial scarcity, so that the prices can go up. And basically licensing spectrum with obligations that help to achieve some of these universal service objectives. And then investment enabling taxation policy. So the taxation environment as well needs to be aligned in such a way that it actually encourages the deployment of infrastructure in areas that need them the most, and also enabling access to the services that are going to be deployed using the infrastructure that's put up in these places. So all of these combined will help from an investor's perspective to reduce the perceived investment risk, and then make a situation where there is a higher expected return on investment. And what you find then is that there's a situation where incentives for mobile operators to invest in wireless infrastructure is greatly enhanced, and the resultant outcome of that is greater network coverage, and ultimately greater access to mobile broadband services. So that has been my presentation. I will speak briefly maybe to the capacity building course, and as a number of you will probably know, the GSMA does run a capacity building program that delivers capacity building training free of charge to policymakers and regulators around the world. And the thinking behind having this capacity building program is from the perspective of the fact that, and I think this is well recognized, policy and regulation is always playing a catch-up game with innovation. And from our perspective, for policy and regulators to be well placed to regulate and create rules for the most innovative, most recent technologies, the knowledge needs to be as up to date as well as possible. And so that is why we have this focus on this capacity building course. One of the courses that we run is closely related to this subject. It's titled the Unlocking Rural Mobile Coverage. The course explores the role of government and private sector in improving connectivity, and it highlights how innovation and infrastructure sharing can help bridge coverage gap, and it highlights best practices in terms of policy and regulation that help to foster investment in rural networks, and it highlights examples of successful rural coverage projects, amongst other very important areas as well that the course will touch on. I will encourage anybody who hasn't yet interacted with our capacity building course to please visit the GSMA website, or just Google GSMA capacity building, or if you would like to be more politically correct, you can directly visit the website itself, gsmatraining.com. The next course, obviously, I mean, in these circumstances, we are only able to deliver the courses online. I think I forgot to mention earlier that we typically we have two modes of delivering the courses in the capacity building brochure. It's either face-to-face or online, and both of them again are free of charge. We absolutely ask for nothing in return. For the face-to-face courses, all we really typically ask for is a venue, an audience of no more than 50, and presentation material and refreshment, just cater to the needs of the enrollees to the fund. But then, to the course. The GSMA will typically take on the cost of providing the course material, the certificates that are going to be issued, and also the cost of the course facilitator. But this is in a pre-COVID era where face-to-face interaction was a lot more possible. These days, we are only able to deliver those courses online. The next delivery of the Unlocking Rural Mobile Coverage course is coming up on the 10th of September. And I do encourage you to visit the GSMA training website. And if you're interested in participating in the course, please do feel free to register. So I think that's all from me. Melly, I don't know if there's anything out of my presentation that I may have missed and you'd like to emphasize on, but other than that, I think that's been it from me.
No, thanks,
like an indication of, oh, good, okay. I was hoping that I hadn't been speaking to myself for the past 40 odd minutes.
No.
All right, good.
Thank you very much, Kamal. Thank you so much for that very informative presentation. And there are a number of questions that are coming in for us to look at and be able to address. And perhaps I'll start with the first one for you, Mel. There's a question that is asking, is the percentage coverage figures shared in slide 2 based on population coverage or geographic coverage?
So the numbers that I shared on digital inclusion, so both around the coverage gap and the usage gap, it's all based on the number of individuals. So we don't look at geographical coverage, but really at who are the people that have access and who are the people who are using or not using the internet yet.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. And the next one is, some of the factors presenting uptake on internet is nomadic nature of people living in arid and semi-arid areas. Is it possible to explore ways of how this gap can be addressed? That's a good question.
Yes, I think that's
a.
But Kamal, please go ahead.
Well, okay. I mean, I suppose we can both provide a perspectives, but I think that basically speaks to some of the challenges that we highlighted earlier in terms of the terrain issues. I think I did not emphasize enough some of the core elements of why that terrain issue is actually a problem, and you've clearly highlighted one. Many of these areas are very sparsely populated in the first instance, and the nomadic nature is one of the factors, especially. And I suppose I think it's Eric who asked this. You're looking at this from obviously the nature of us Africans. A lot of the livelihoods that we lead are nomadic in nature. There's a constant movement and whatnot. And this presents the issue of being able to, I mean, obviously you can't expect that sites are going to be deployed to cover 100% of a geographical area. So this does present its own challenges. And that's why, from my perspective, I like to think about the universal service access problem from a supply side perspective. it is a problem that needs multiple types of solutions to be able to help address. So there will be solutions that largely will be mobile infrastructure related, but obviously there will be other niche areas where alternative technologies as well will be able to fit in. Mary, I don't know if you would like to add anything to that.
No, I think that's a very comprehensive answer. Nothing to add there.
Okay, great. So we have another one coming. So the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the importance of broadband connectivity. Countries with better ICT infrastructure and higher level of adoption have fared better in coping with the pandemic. For countries where USF is already established, what role do you think USF can play in supporting ICT infrastructure and adoption? I think we could have a comment from both of you.
Meli, would you like to go first?
Yes, happy to go first.
Okay.
Yes, I think the role of the USF in terms of, because I will speak for the adoption and internet uses part, and then maybe Kamal, you can cover a bit more on the infrastructure element of this question. I think traditionally USFs have been mostly used for the supply side of telecommunications, and increasingly we see discussions around can we use universal response for the uptake of new services. I think it's very important to keep in mind that looking at those opportunities to increase demand, to focus on the people where it can have the most direct impact. So that's something that needs to be done jointly together with operators. So USF, however it's governed, should work together with mobile operators to identify which individuals would stand to benefit most. For example, if we look at ways to improve affordability, for example, some people might benefit much more from additional government support than some other individuals. So it's very important to start from a perspective, if we provide, let's say, a government subsidy on a data voucher, or maybe think about ways how can we improve the affordability of devices, that we look at the individuals for which that impact is sustainable. So if we give support to an individual that is has no ability to pay for such a service themselves, but is willing to pay, there can be the largest impact compared to someone who is not yet willing or less understanding of the benefits of the internet and cannot pay yet. For those people, it's much better to look at alternative ways to provide support first. So looking at building digital skills or ensuring that there is an ecosystem with relevant services before using these type of funds. So it really depends on that strong collaboration between operators and government.
From an infrastructure perspective, I think this has clearly, obviously highlighted the benefits of having access, and there is an opportunity here for universal service funds to be brought to bear in terms of helping to deploy the infrastructure that is needed to provide access in quite a number of areas. I mean, kids have been out of school since February, March, for example, and there have been many sort of approaches to being able to provide them continued access to learning materials. There's content online where it's possible, but you find a lot of radio stations, for example, and TV stations are being used as well to broadcast lessons. But for the most part, I think that you'll find that the students who are fortunate enough to be able to have access to content online, be able to interact with their educational frameworks through online access, will probably most likely get the most rich and most beneficial access to that sort of content. And this is where universal service funds can be used to deploy infrastructure in areas that do not currently have access, but obviously have large populations of students, and that level of access is going to be able to be provided to those sort of students as well. So I think that's one key area in terms of the education. And everybody's been working from home since March as well. How many people that live in these sorts of areas are able to participate with their work environment based on the level of access that they have? Again, it brings to the fore the need for universal service funds to critically identify these sorts of areas and deploy infrastructure in collaboration with the service providers who are going to provide the service using the infrastructure in the first place. So there are many opportunities. I think that universal service funds can be brought to bear, and it's a matter of basically having that level of collaboration between themselves, the service providers, and to a large extent the wider governing bodies of our countries to be able to identify where these infrastructure will make the most benefit, at least for now.
Yeah, for sure. And thank you so much for that. So moving on to another question from Kwame. So he asks, where is low penetration of broadband user device as a barrier of usage of internet? I guess this one, Mel, you could respond to. So the issue of device.
Yes, no, that's a very good point. So when we talk about affordability, I don't think I mentioned, we talk about both the affordability of devices as well as the affordability of data service. So it's important to make that split. And device ownership is one of the key barriers. It's the entry point for the majority of people to start using the internet. So when we look at the uptake of mobile devices, it's actually quite encouraging. It's increasing across the board. It stands around 43% in the African continent of those people that already have a connection. But there's room for improvement there. I think operators are showing great level of innovation in terms of how can we make sure that more people can afford a device that can enable internet access. So it used to be that there's only smartphones available, and now you see kind of a new type of device, which is the smart feature phone. So it allows individuals to go online and use kind of the key elements of the internet without having to pay for a more expensive smartphone that can be more beneficial to other type of users. The device, the way of obtaining a device is apart from the smart feature phones being much cheaper. So in some countries they're available for as low as 11 to 20 US dollars. That's a significant decrease from the device that we've seen previously. We also see mobile operators together with other partners innovating the way of financing that cost of a device. I think we've seen a recent example in Kenya by Safaricom. I believe there might be someone online actually from Safaricom, where they partnered with Google, making sure that individuals could pay, I believe, 90 cents US dollars per day over a period of 9 months to pay off that device. So I think we see a great level of innovation happening there. I think governments have a role to play as well in this space. So making sure that mobile operators or financial services providers can innovate with alternative ways of credit scoring. So that requires kind of the use of alternative data or mobile subscriber data to create kind of a credit profile for those people who have never used financial services before. And based on that credit profile, then through partnership, these devices can be pre-financed and individuals could pay back. So I think enabling that through policies is very important. So we see the device levels increasing. It still remains a challenge, and especially when we look at the type of device being used and the awareness of the internet, we see great difference. So a lot of work remains there, but we see great innovations in that space.
Great, thank you so much. And I think just to add to what you've mentioned with regards to devices, I think another key element is looking at the taxes that are levied on these particular devices and governments looking at how to reduce these particular taxes specifically for devices that are aimed at accelerating adoption in different countries. So the low-end devices, and looking at how to make sure that they are more and more accessible and affordable to consumers as we continue progressing the issue on internet acceleration. So moving on, so we have another question, a couple of questions that have come in. Instead of the gradual reduction of contribution, perhaps USF objectives should be set for a specific time frame and the contribution limited to the period. I think it may not make sense for MNOs to contribute indefinitely. Do you have any comments on this? Question that's coming.
That's an interesting approach, and it's one of the methods that can be used basically to help phase out the fund. And I do agree with you. I think that is certainly one approach that could certainly be, yes, definitely. Set out an objective for a fixed period of time within which that fund is expected to exist. You set out very clear targets and objectives. Set out a clear roadmap as to how those objectives are going to be achieved, and with a group of stakeholders, you have a plan to achieve those objectives. And if you're able to meet all of those targets, there really is no need for the fund to be able to continue to exist afterwards, if at all. If it must exist, I mean, it can exist perhaps to a very much smaller level. I think it's impossible to expect that you're going to get 100% of your population connected. There's always going to be a small segment of society that is going to need some help in getting connected. But that aside, I think, yes, that is definitely one of the approaches that can be adopted in terms of how to help phase out the fund. So perhaps, again, it's also an alternative for governments that have not yet developed a fund but are thinking about deploying one. Maybe this is one approach as well. If they feel very, very strongly about creating a fund, then perhaps this is one of the approaches that needs to be considered. Set out the fund to exist only within a certain period of time, set out very clear objectives, and create a roadmap that will help you achieve those objectives, and make sure that you stick to those timelines, and after that, you can basically eliminate the need for the fund. So yeah, I completely agree.
Okay, great, thank you. So another question, how can the USF be used to caution operators in areas of high insecurity where infrastructure put up by USF has been brought down by insurgents? So addressing the issue of insecurity and the cost that comes with running this particular site.
Yeah. I think that's something that goes beyond the scope of what the USF is able to achieve. And I say this because I've also been in a situation actually where we've interacted with the Universal Service Fund to deploy infrastructure, and we were in basically exactly that kind of situation where there were parts of the geographical area that insurgency was reigning, and constantly, whether sites that were deployed by Universal Service Funds or not, sites were being attacked and being brought down. But this is something that is beyond the scope of what the Universal Service Fund can help achieve. I mean, it's in the objective, the core objective of the Universal Service Fund is to deploy infrastructure. What we've just highlighted here is a lot more of a security-related issue really than a Universal Service Fund, and it's not something that you'd expect that the Universal Service Fund will be able to help address. So I think that's something that the wider governance environment needs to take stock of, and help to provide as much assistance as possible. So in this instance, maybe the role of the Universal Service Fund would be to help to liaise or to interact or to engage the security outfit of the state, for example, to help provide any extra additional level of security that is required for these sorts of infrastructure deployments.
Okay, just as a follow-up to that question is, in terms of the cost of running the USF sites, what sort of interventions or support do you believe the USF could give to operators to make the sites more viable, and perhaps some of these costs could be in line with the costs of caused by the insecurity issues.
Yeah. I mean, the one simple perspective I've seen adopted is in basically helping to subsidize the cost of the operating expenditure, in addition to helping subsidize the cost of the deployment of the physical infrastructure itself. So the fund sets out, for example, to take on, say, for instance, 50% of the cost of running each site or for a certain period of time, and say, for instance, within that certain period of time, there will also be other efforts that will be applied either by the fund or by the service providers or by the general telecoms environment to help to stimulate demand in those areas, such that at some future point, those sites become commercially viable themselves and they're able to organically take care of the expenditure of operating those sites themselves. But in the first instance, there is need for the sites, for the fund to explore ways in which operating expenditure of sites that are deployed in these sorts of areas is also subsidized, because it is a huge cost. In many instances, it actually even costs a lot more to run the site than it actually costs to put up the physical infrastructure itself. So there is need for our universal service funds that are currently fairly active to also begin to explore a lot more the need to be able to help in terms of addressing the operating expenditure issues.
Okay, great. So there's another question. From the study conducted, what are the best practice adopted or being proposed to avoid political interference on the USF, as most of these are run by regulatory bodies and are part of a political system?
Yes, true. And that speaks to the recommendation I think that I made towards the end in terms of the initial framework that was used to set up the fund itself. So there is a very important need here, and we see this now with the benefit of foresight. There's a very important need for the foundations of that fund to ensure that it is acting as independently as possible. It's perhaps you could have, for instance, a structure that, say, for instance, reports directly to either a particular council, or it is owned, for instance, by the group of stakeholders that are funding it. Structures can be put in place depending on the environment that you exist in to ensure that this fund operates as independently of policy and regulatory, of policy interventions, government interference, and political interference as possible. So there are ways that can be done, but it all lies in the underlying foundations within which, upon which these funds were created themselves.
Okay, great. There's another question that just come in. The chosen mechanism of increasing coverage has usually been the application of a USF scheme, but these have generally been unsuccessful because the funds have often not been used, and so they have become another de facto tax. What is your recommendation to increase coverage?
Sorry, can you repeat the question again, please?
Okay, sure. The chosen mechanism of increasing coverage has usually been the application of a USF scheme, but this has generally been unsuccessful because the funds have often not been used and so have become another de facto tax.
Yeah.
What is your recommendation to increase coverage?
Yeah, so this speaks to the final slide that I had up in terms of making the regulatory and policy environment encourage that coverage gap to be bridged. You have the funds in many of these places, and you rightly pointed out, they've not been as successful as you would imagine in helping to bridge this coverage gap, and they've basically become another tax. It's just another item for service providers to always have on their budgets every year. They pay for it, but they're not expecting that anything is going to come of it. And by the way, this also helps in making this contributes to how expensive services are in the end, because they have to recoup that cost in some way. But that's topic for another day. So how do we improve coverage? Having the right policies in place is absolutely key. And I mentioned the need for many of our markets still do not have technology neutral licensing frameworks, for example. So you've licensed, for instance, the 900 megahertz band, which is used for typically for 2G, right? It's a band that has very, very excellent coverage characteristics, similar with the 800 and the 700, which is better in terms of providing coverage. But these bands have been assigned on a technology specific perspective. They've been given to service providers and they've been told, take this spectrum, but you can only go and deploy 2G services with it. And here is a need for us to, in this day and age, for instance, where you have a lot of the people that live in these areas. I mentioned the need, for example, to provide broadband access to students that live in these areas so that they can interact with their educational content. For service providers who have been given the license to operate with the spectrum, they've deployed a 2G site in that area with the 900 megahertz band, but that's as much as they're able to provide. It's not going to be anywhere near the level of service that's required to provide broadband access because they are restricted by the regulatory framework. So we need to visit the regulatory framework, the licensing framework, allow technology neutrality to happen so that the most suitable spectrum for these sorts of areas can be deployed by service providers to be able to help provide this access. I cite the example of Ghana, for instance, where last year or the year before, I think it was, they allowed technology neutrality using the 900, and mobile operators were then able to deploy 3G services on spectrum that would traditionally have been 2G. We have some numbers on coverage and usage that Mele presented earlier, and if you look historically for the past 6, 7, 8 years or so, there's a consistent 2-3% increase in terms of the coverage that was being provided. But in that period where that technology neutrality was around, there was almost a doubling of that coverage provision figure across Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, obviously, there were a number of factors that contributed to that growth in that time, but our analysts highlight that one of the key factors as well that contributed to that was basically just that allowing of technology neutrality in that band. So one key area really, I think, is allowing that technology neutrality in a cost-effective manner as well. The second is in terms of spectrum policy. We live in a wireless environment, allowing access to spectrum in a cost-effective manner and also using it as a tool to achieve your own coverage universal service objectives is key. I cite the example of Sweden, and I think you should look this up as well, where they recently assigned the 700 megahertz band. And instead of charging huge fees, there was one slot of that band of the entire spectrum available in that band that was assigned on the basis of, okay, here's this spectrum. Normally it will cost you, for example, $100, but we're going to give it to you for $20 if you agree to go and deploy services in this area and this area and this area that do not have access. So there's a tool here that exists with government already that can be used to help bridge this gap. And it will be provided on a basis that is also beneficial to the service provider. So they get access to spectrum. The cost is sensible from their perspective. They're able to deploy services in the areas that they would like commercially, and because they've gotten the spectrum at very low costs, the cost of deploying in those rural areas as well sort of kind of balances out. So there are a number of regulatory and policy tools. I just note that we have about 5 minutes or so to end, and this is a topic that we can sit and discuss for the whole day. But obviously, these are just two basic areas that I've highlighted. Taxation is the key. We've deployed the infrastructure. People need to access the services. Are they able to afford those devices that they need to access the services? What can we do from a taxation perspective to help reduce the cost of those devices so that people are able to have access to the services? Can the Universal Service Fund as well be used to subsidize some of these? These are debates that are being had in many fora as well. So there's a number of areas where policy and regulation can be used to help bridge this coverage gap, and I think it's something that definitely needs to be explored.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kamal. And as you rightfully said it, we have a few minutes to go and just a couple of other questions to go. But generally, we have some questions around the issue of disbursement of the USF. The study that we conducted, has there been any recommendations on how the USF should be disbanded in terms of the revenue, the authorities themselves doing it, setting up the sites themselves, or the sites being set up by the operators? We have like about 3 questions that cover around that area. So maybe very quickly we can comment.
Okay, really quickly, I think for me this goes back to the issue of stakeholder engagement. There has to be that connect between the Universal Service Fund and the stakeholders that it sort of manages the fund for, be it in the form of their participation, for example, in the governance of the fund itself, or at least in terms of the interactions and the consultations before decisions are taken. That's absolutely key. You need to have those conversations so that you can rightly identify the most efficient, the most cost-effective ways within which this infrastructure can be deployed. If that collaboration, that interaction does not exist, then you're going to have the fund operating in this direction and the service providers, stakeholders, thinking in that direction. There's no interconnect. And naturally, you're going to find that a lot of the projects that the fund undertakes are going to fail. So collaboration is absolutely, absolutely key. There are funds out there that I mentioned earlier that have representation from stakeholders on their boards. They all sit down together, help to develop the plans for that fund. And you find that some of these kind of funds are the more successful ones in this general USF environment. So consultation is absolutely key.
Thank you so much. And I think we'll just, we only have time to cover maybe 2 more questions. And one of them is around, so a lot of NRAs in the region, the issue right now is no longer the issue on technology neutral licenses, but rather the cost of spectrum. How do you think this affects coverage and adoption in the region?
How the cost of spectrum affects coverage? I mean, it plays a huge role. Spectrum is the lifeblood of the industry. It's the lifeblood of the access that we have, especially in Sub Saharan Africa, where we do not have anywhere near a sustainable level of fixed line access, for example. The entire access that we have, the majority of it is reliant on wireless access, and so therefore access to cost-effective spectrum is absolutely key. Where you have spectrum being offered in prices at prices that are prohibitive to investment levels, you're going to find that the coverage problem is exacerbated. Pricing spectrum very, very highly takes away funds that would typically have been used in deploying infrastructure in some of these sorts of areas. Speaking to the example of Sweden, it just basically shows you how government has thought about what the tools that it currently has, thought about what the service providers actually want, and then been able to create a link so that everybody comes out of the situation happy. So spectrum policy is absolutely key. I can speak again to this for ages, but for want of time, I will invite you to, again, look at the capacity building courses that we have. There's a course on spectrum management, and I invite you to have a look at attending that course. We also have quite a number of resources on spectrum pricing as well, so please do feel free to either reach out to me directly, or you can look up on the GSMA website under spectrum resources, and you'll find quite a number of resources on spectrum pricing that will help to elaborate on this point.
Thank you so much. And perhaps maybe the final question. There's a question that talks about, thank you, Kamal, concise and informative presentation. You make interesting proposals, both in terms of scrapping the USF fund or reduction of operators' contribution to it. What are your views on how either ideas will be received from the government end of the table?
Yeah, obviously, these sorts of recommendations are. I mean, when you've had a certain approach for a very long time, it's very, very difficult to change thinking. However, we continue to need to have these sort of interventions, these sort of engagements, so that this information is made available as much as possible to governments. There are many instances where perhaps it is the case that the information is just has not been presented to them. They are not aware of it. There are instances where you need to have conversations to change a thought process, for example. So engagement, collaboration between policymakers, regulators, and industry continues to be key in having to drive change in this sort of thought process and line of thought.
Okay, thank you very much. And just one last one that has just come in. I think it's still around the issue of security. What type of incentives are being referred to in the presentation as part of the subsidies that can be given to mobile operators?
I'm not sure I understood that question completely, but I assume that this is to do, for instance, with how the fund subsidizes the deployment of infrastructure.
I think it's subsidies for especially maintaining these sites.
Oh, in terms of maintaining the sites?
Yes.
Yeah, like I mentioned, I think I mentioned that in the initial proposals, for instance, when a fund puts out its intentions to provide funding for the deployment of infrastructure in areas that it has identified, it invites proposals from stakeholders that are interested, and at that level of interaction, you get proposals that say, okay, this is the level of subsidy that will require for the capital expenditure and putting up the infrastructure itself. But then this is also the amount of subsidy that we think we are going to need to continue to run the sites over a certain period of time, and after which we can revisit and revise and understand whether these sites have become commercially sustainable and there's no need for the subsidies any longer, or we need to extend the period within which those subsidies are provided. So there are a number of ways you can look at it but key is to have those conversations in the first instance. I think talking to the stakeholders who are going to, for the most part, undertake the activities that run these sites is what is going to bring forward the most important information. So have these conversations between policymakers and stakeholders that are deploying sites and deploying infrastructure.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we've run out of time. This has been such an engaging discussion and very interesting. And we shall be sharing a copy of the presentation to all the participants after this. We'd like to appreciate everybody for logging in and for making time to be with us. Feel free to reach out to any of us, myself, Kamal, or Mel, for any further questions you may be having on this topic, and we are happy to respond to you. Again, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, and we look forward to the next engagement that we shall be having. On the 20th, which is on Thursday, we shall be having a French version of this session. So please feel free to tune in, or rather to log in if you'd be interested to cover this in French, or maybe share that information with your colleagues who cover the French-speaking countries. Unless Kamal or Mel, you have any closing remarks, I'd like to close the session at this point.
No, thank you very much, Carol. And it's been good to have this level of interaction. At least I see quite a number of, well, they are no longer industry colleagues, to be honest. They are more friends and family these days. My boss, Kwame, from Ghana, Dominic, I see you. Ade, who used to sit across the table from me once upon a time. In days past, we would have met 3, 4, 5 times already this year, but unfortunately, these are the sorts of platforms that we only have to interact these days, and we look forward to a time when we'll be able to have better face-to-face engagement. In Dae as well, I see quite a few people that if I needed to spend time calling everybody's name, we'll probably take another session also. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining. And if you have any questions, like Carol said, please do feel free to send through an email.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Present. And just want to very quickly mention that for those who are more interested in the usage gap policies to address it, we'll be working on a policy paper that we plan to launch later this year. So in the meantime, feel free to reach out for more questions.
Yes,
yeah. So thank you very much.
I just wanted to emphasize, look out for that coverage paper, please. It should be published sometime soon. I think it makes very interesting. It will make a very, very interesting read.
Yes, thank you very much. And I wish everyone a good day.